The Pentagon is calling for 2 additions to the U.S. nuclear arsenal. One brings back the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, a capability the U.S. maintained during the Cold War. The other adds a low-yield or less powerful submarine-launched ballistic missile. The air, land, and sea-based components of the U.S. nuclear arsenal are all expected to reach the end of their use in the next decade. Experts say that if the United States does not act now to modernize its inventory, the whole point of that arsenal, deterring other nations from using their nuclear weapons, could be in jeopardy.
There is this notion that United States actions will cause an arms race. But I think arms race is already going on, except right now the United States is not racing.
Analysts say Russia and China have about a 2-decade head start on updating their nuclear weapons programs. Also looming large, the threat of North Korea and Iran developing nuclear weapons. To counter this changing environment, the Pentagon is calling for 2 additions to the U.S. nuclear arsenal. One brings back the nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, a capability the U.S. maintained during the Cold War. The other adds a low-yield or less powerful submarine-launched ballistic missile. This addition would impede any ideas America's strongest nuclear adversary, Russia, might have about using its own low-yield weapons to get its way in a small conflict.
Is how do the Russians discriminate this low yield from a high yield, and therefore how do you prevent this from lowering the threshold for nuclear war, increasing the prospect that the Russians see this as a full-on nuclear attack and respond with a full-on retaliation? Thank you.
You bet. So as you walk through that, there's actually 2 pieces of that question. The first piece is about a requirement for conventional prompt global strike. We still have a requirement for that capability, by the way. STRATCOM still supports the development of that as an option for the President of the United States. I support that, going down that path as well. But as you said, 10 years ago when we looked at the Trident for doing that mission, that ambiguity was not a good ambiguity that we thought. This deployment on Trident of a low-yield nuclear weapon, an SLBM, does not have that problem. Because if the Russians employ a low-yield nuclear weapon on the battlefield and they see something coming out of the Trident coming their direction, it's nuclear. There's no doubt it's nuclear. It's coming nuclear. They just went nuclear, and now there's a nuclear response coming back. The question is, how big is that response? And they will find out in about 30 minutes. They will. It won't be a significant issue for them to understand, because it is not a mass raid out of the middle of this country. It is not a mass raid out of the submarines. It is a focused weapon, and they will be able to characterize that and understand it. It does not have the ambiguity of that kind of piece. So it gives the President an option to respond in a way that would allow a better understanding of what is going on behalf of the Russians. So I look at it just the opposite the way you described it. I don't see it as escalatory at all. I see it as a smart, I see that as just a logical extension of our capabilities that we should have as warfighters to present to the President of the United States. Again, it shouldn't just be go big. You know, Henry Kissinger had a great point recently. He looked at that scenario and he said, if you don't have these low-yield capabilities, what you're doing is you're putting the President of the United States in a position where his only choices are surrender or suicide. That's not a good place to be. Those aren't good choices. I don't like either one of those. So we need these capabilities to provide that, not surrender, not suicide, but provide an appropriate, tailored response to the situation that is there.
I would prefer that we go back to the path we were on 10 years ago of both sides reducing the role of nuclear weapons in their foreign policies. I just don't think that Russia's really giving us that choice right now. So temporarily, I think we have to be a little bit more assertive than I would even prefer.
The Obama administration's posture review in 2010 struck a delicate balance between the ultimate goal of a world without nuclear weapons while still maintaining a safe and effective arsenal. The Trump administration's version focuses mostly on that second point, maintaining America's arsenal, putting arms control in the back seat.
Sir, Secretary Mattis has suggested that the new SLICM might potentially be a bargaining chip to correct the Russian INF Treaty GLICM violation. The nuclear posture review suggests that something more might be required, that there might not only have to be a correction of the INF treaty violation, but the Russians would have to reduce their tactical nuclear weapons as well. And even then, it's not specific that the U.S. might give up the SLICM in that context. Is this system a bargaining chip potentially for INF? And can you put a little flesh on what the plans are for fielding, deploying, developing this system? Because if you don't go ahead with it and there is no IOC, it's probably not going to be a very useful bargaining chip.
So I think I never want to speak for Secretary Mattis because that could get me fired, and that's a bad thing. But I did see his response yesterday to a similar question, and I know from having talked to him that he doesn't like the term bargaining chip, and I don't like the term bargaining chip either. These capabilities that we're talking about are responses to the threat that's out there. Now, if that gives our diplomats the ability to then negotiate with our adversaries, negotiate with the Russians, and come to a place where we don't think that those weapons are good for our country, their country, or for the earth, and we can negotiate those, that's great. But that's not why we're building those. We're building those as a response to the threat. Now, I hope that our diplomats can use them to effectively walk down that path. Now, as regard to INF, we're also proposing research and development into ground-launched capabilities. That's also part of the President's budget, going down that path. Research and development is not prohibited by the INF Treaty. What is prohibited is the employment and deployment of those weapons. Russia has deployed those weapons now. That's what violated the INF Treaty. So we're proposing that we'll go down that research development place. If they don't come back into the fold in INF, then we'll be prepared to respond accordingly as we go forward. It's going to be a very complicated discussion as we go forward, but the capabilities we propose are to respond to the threat and then hopefully give our diplomats some room to move. Fair enough, sir? Thank you.
General, thank you. I'm Alexei Fomenko, Second Secretary at the Russian Embassy. You spoke a lot about Russia, and it is also mentioned a lot in the NPR. So I wanted to ask you two questions. First, how did you make the determination that Russia was increasing its reliance on nuclear weapons, especially since in the unclassified documents, the 2014 nuclear military doctrine says that in fact we are decreasing the reliance and that we are introducing non-nuclear deterrence measures much in line with what the United States was doing at the moment. And the second question is, how can Russia be expanding the nuclear arsenal given the START treaty limits, which I think the State Department has recently said Russia was observing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll say there's an interesting dichotomy in our nation. We call it the say-do gap, where you say one thing but you do another. That's called a say-do gap. So we listen very closely to what your president says. We listen very closely to what your leadership say, and then we watch very, very closely of what your nation does. And when we put those two things together, we see two things. We see a very mixed message on the say side, but we also see a commitment to full modernization of the capability and a commitment to the building non-strategic nuclear weapons and a commitment to employing a new doctrine of nuclear weapons that is very dangerous, we think, in the overall scheme of the world. And because of those pieces, and we put them together and we watch very closely, we have to consider those a threat. I'm a military officer. I'm not a politician, thank goodness. And as a military officer, I have to look at what is real. I have to look at what is there. So we watch. We watch the tests. We watch the capabilities. We watch all those pieces come together, and we understand the employment of those forces in a stated doctrine, and that's how we characterize the threat. That's why we recommend to our political leadership how we have to respond to that threat. That's where we come down that path, sir. Thank you.
Hi, sir. James Drew from Aviation Week. So a couple of things. Here's a free one for you. Have you asked SpaceX for some recallable ICBMs? That might be an interesting one. But should China be part of any future arms reduction negotiations? And should the Air Force be stepping up and flying those Reapers with the forward-looking sensor balls that you mentioned?
So I guess there are three questions there. Number one, SpaceX does not like when I talk to them about weapons on top of their rockets. Just not a big thing for them. The second piece of the question was, so the China piece is, I'm not a diplomat. I'm a military officer. I have to deal with the Russia threat, the China threat, the North Korea threat, the Iranian threat. That's what I deal with. But as an American, I would like China to be part of any discussion on the future. I would like China, look at the missiles that China is building. I would like to understand China's role in intermediate nuclear forces. I would like to understand what those kind of pieces are. I would like to have an aggressive dialogue between the State Department and the Chinese Foreign Ministry and those kind of pieces. I would like to have all those things happen. That's not my job. My job is to deal with the world that it is, to deal with the world that could be, and be prepared for those kind of things, and allow, ma'am, how are you? The State Department to walk down that path, but I really want them to go. And then as far as how do you use Reapers, that's really not my lane. I don't know if you looked at the Stratcom force structure or not, but I don't have any Reapers in the force structure. So that's really a broader question for the Air Force. I am informed on that, but it's bad to stand on stage with media in the audience and just give you a wild-ass response. That doesn't mean anything. All right.
Harris with Inside the Air Force. And if I could quote from the NPR just to make sure I get the words right, it says DoD is going to prioritize R&D funding for rapid development of nuclear delivery systems, alternative basing modes.
Could you back up?
I'm
Could
sorry.
you back up and start and just slow down a little bit?
Yeah, sorry.
Because there's just an echo here. So
It says DoD is going to prioritize R&D funding for alternative basing modes, missile defense systems, and things like that. So are the alternative basing modes? Can you dig into what options you're looking at for that? Are they going to be part of the ongoing GBSD and LRSO modernization programs? I'm just looking for a little more insight into that.
You bet. So as you walk down, it's important to know that the NPR, when it talks about the Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, it does not say submarine launched cruise missile. It says Sea-Launched Cruise Missile, because we want to look at a number of options. Everything from surface DDG-1000s into submarines, different types of submarines, fast attack submarines, SSGNs, SSBNs. Look across those boards and make sure we understand what it is. That's what the President's budget has requested us to go look at those platforms, and we're going to walk down that path. When you look at the other capabilities that we're talking about for defensive systems, we're looking at multiple basing options for defense: air, ground, sea. We're looking at a number of different options for looking at the defense side. And then from the ground-launched cruise missile capability that we're going to explore the technology for, we're going to walk down that. That tends to be a focus on a ground-based system, but we'll have a ground-based element, a sea-launched element, and we'll look at those capabilities as an entity. We have not made any commitment to deploy any of those at this point. We've just recommended in the President's budget that we begin to explore those technologies.